Welcome back, America. I'm Hugh Hewitt. Pleased to welcome back Matt Pottinger. Good morning, Matt. How are you?
Hugh, good morning. How are you today?
Thank you for being up early and joining me. I am great. Matt, as by way of intro, I want people to understand, in the 30s, when Churchill and about a half dozen parliament members, private members of parliament, they weren't on the front bench, warned almost every week about the Germans and Hitler, Goebbels come out and called them the Churchill clique. There are today in the United States and abroad in various places about a dozen people who are serious about what Xi and the CCP are up to. You are a card-carrying member of what I'll call the Dragon Bear clique, are you not?
No, I'll take it. And it doesn't please me to say that I think we are really headed into a dangerous situation here.
Now, Matt, I want people to understand who you are and why you have the experience to speak. I've told them you were the Deputy National Security Advisor and that you were in the Trump administration for 4 years. Would you explain the rest of your credentials and what you're doing now and why you're doing it?
Sure. Yeah. So I had worked for almost a decade, Hugh, as a fellow reporter. I was writing for Reuters and the Wall Street Journal. I went from journalism into the Marine Corps, where I spent a fair bit of time in Afghanistan and Iraq, but also in Okinawa in Japan, doing some preparation for a possible conflict in the Western Pacific. Before I ended up in the Trump administration, as you said, I'm doing a lot of open source research now into Xi Jinping and his plans. I'm at the Hoover Institution and the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, but I've found that the best guide for where China's headed is actually the dictator who leads China, and it's very important to read what he says in his own words, including when he thinks we're not listening. When Chinese language only speeches sometimes that are kept secret for weeks or months or even years. And if you read what Xi has been saying in his first decade in power, I think that he has a real aspiration to try to annex Taiwan and is going to have to rely on coercive means to do it.
So let's begin where we need to end. Why is China the number one threat to the security of the United States today?
Yeah, look, China views us as, under the Chinese Communist Party, as their primary adversary. They've been very explicit about that. If you look at an increasing amount of scholarship, including, I would remark on Rush Doshi's book, The Long Game. Rush actually works for President Biden now. He's one of his directors on the National Security Council staff. If you look at that and other scholarship that looks back a few decades, again, primary source research, primary source materials that have been largely overlooked by a lot of scholars, you find that Beijing decided at the end of the Cold War to regard the United States as their chief adversary, ideological and military and geostrategic foe, and decided that it needed to gather more strength, increase its military power and its economic power before it could really unveil its intention to regard us as their primary adversary. But now they've done that. The fig leaf has blown away. And Beijing believes that the United States poses an existential threat just by our existence. It believes that Taiwan, as a democracy, the first successful Chinese democracy, ethnic Chinese democracy in the world, poses a mortal threat just by its existence. And it intends to wage war, including through nonviolent means, economic and financial warfare, using criminal proceeds. China is now the number one. Chinese criminal organizations are now the number one money launderers in the world, supporting, for example, the robust fentanyl trade into our borders. All of these are things that it regards as a means to eroding American power.
Now, Matt Pottinger, last week I re-listened to, probably the third time I've been through, William Manchester's second volume, Alone. And it's about the 30s. It's really not just about Churchill, it's about the 30s. And Hitler and his gang hid from the world what they were doing. They built and bought arms from the Soviet Union. They rebuilt the Luftwaffe without anyone knowing. They did it when nobody knew what was going on and everyone was worried about making them pay reparations. It's so spooky because what they did in 10 years, China has been doing for 30, and we didn't figure it out until maybe Donald Trump got to the White House. When do you think the light went on for most Americans that we were funding our mortal enemy?
Yeah. William Manchester, a fellow Marine, also fellow graduate of what became the University of Massachusetts. It was a smaller college when he was there. Yeah, look, I think the American people have a better instinct for what you just described, Hugh, than a lot of U.S.-focused scholars on China. People who are more narrowly focused on the issue had a harder time recognizing Beijing's aspirations. They were still clinging to the very nice notion that we might be able to liberalize China and liberalize and pluralize the power of the Chinese Communist Party, but it just didn't work out that way. So I don't know. I think the American people started to develop that sense a solid decade ago, but it took time for Washington to catch up to where American people's instincts really were.
Now I want to come to Taiwan, and because I want to put front and square. If they attack Taiwan, what will happen to America's markets? I just want people to understand it's really about them. If China attacks Taiwan, I expect very bad things to happen in the international economy, which will be instantly reflected in the American stock market. Am I correct?
Oh, yeah. This would be, the Ukraine war and its effects times 10. This would be a catastrophic conflict, irrespective of whether the U.S. gets involved or not. In fact, if we are passive and fail to deter this conflict, we're going to wake up in a very different world, and one where U.S. status as a superpower can no longer be taken for granted.
Matt, has anyone hired you to advise on the setup of a mutual fund that is a hedge against that? Because there isn't one, to my knowledge. I was talking to Ambassador O'Brien, our mutual friend. I said, why don't you go find your clients and tell them to open up a fund where I can bank some money in the event that China attacks Taiwan? Because I'm going to lose everything I've got in the stock market if that happens. People have no idea what happens besides the freedom, besides to our long-term geopolitical interests. We're going to be wiped out. I mean, it'll be a depression. Am I wrong?
Well, look, I am aware that there are some people working on funds or indices that are designed to insulate investors somewhat from the direction that the relationship's already going, even in the absence of a kinetic war. Beijing's strategy is one of decoupling from the Western world, specifically to make itself self-reliant and for technology needs, and then in sort of a jiu-jitsu move to make the rest of the industrialized world increasingly reliant on China for technology needs. So there are people who are thinking about this. I think the real outrage is that the major indices over the years, as China has become more and more opaque, less and less transparent in economic indicators. They've kicked out reporters. They've unplugged a lot of major macroeconomic data. As they become more opaque, a lot of indexes that are based in the West have weighted Chinese companies more heavily into their indices. And that has put a lot of investors at risk in a sort of passive way. I've talked to people who care a lot about not investing in China, who found that as they dig into their 401ks, as they look at mutual funds and Vanguard funds and so forth, that they are sort of stealthily over time have become increasingly invested passively into China. And so I think that you're going to start to see more products on the market that address that fact and allow people to choose not to be invested there.
Now, Matt Pottinger, I want to go back. Last question of this segment. We'll come back. China is a military giant. They have built more ships in a shorter period of time than anyone ever in the country, in the history of the world. They've gone from 0 to 40 to 60 to 100 miles per hour. Do you think we know with some certainty their military capabilities?
Well, look, you're right. They're building a massive fleet. They add something on the order of the entire Australian Navy every 18 months to their arsenal. So they have a formidable rocket force. This was really sort of an asymmetric advantage that they accumulated over the last quarter century. The ability to target our surface vessels at range while they're moving. I do think that we have a sense for the power that they've accumulated. But sometimes, a lot of people point to the fact that the Chinese military has not been to war since 1979 when it launched its punitive raids into Vietnam. Sometimes, paradoxically, that makes a country more likely to wage war because its own top brass can end up overestimating their military power and underestimating how wars go wrong, underestimating the human factors in war. I don't think that the fact that they haven't gone to war is necessarily an impediment to them choosing to go to war, Hugh.
And so we have a minute. Is their technology when it comes to military hardware as good as ours? Is the J-20 capable of keeping up with the F-21, for example?
Look, I think that their Air Force, their Navy, which have been the two focuses over the last quarter century, as well as the rocket forces, are formidable. These are the things that we need to be training against, doing tabletop exercises against, like we saw members of Congress doing just the other day. I think it was good that they were doing that. But war. The thing that makes me uncomfortable is that we don't know for sure how a war would play out, and we know from people who've studied the history of war, like Geoffrey Blaney, the Australian historian, that this becomes the true form of accounting and reckoning for the balance of power ends up becoming war itself.
I'll be right back with Matt Pottinger. Stay tuned, America. 2 more segments with Matt ahead. Welcome back, America. I'm Hugh Hewitt, joined by Matt Pottinger, former Deputy National Security Advisor, Marine, and, of course, longtime member of the China clique in the United States, people who are serious. Matt, you referenced one of your fellow Marines in Congress, Mike Gallagher. Representative Gallagher is currently chair of the House Select Committee on Engagement with the Chinese Communist Party, and they ran a war game 2 weeks ago at the Center for the New American Security. They walked in, they didn't know how it was going to open, and the first move of the game was China kinetically attack Guam and Okinawa to disable the American deterrent. That is a wake-up call. How probable is that sort of a Pearl Harbor opening to an invasion of the Taiwan in Matt Pottinger's mind?
Yeah, it's interesting. When we read what the Chinese military is doing in the way of advancing its own doctrine for a Taiwan scenario, and some of the literature that's coming out of China, they assume in a lot of their own war games that the United States is going to enter a war sooner or later anyway, and therefore there is a school of thought that Chinese forces need to neutralize U.S. forces in the region early in order to increase their chances of succeeding in an invasion, an annexation of Taiwan. So it is a real possibility. You have to remember that Xi Jinping, if he decides to roll these dice, the iron dice of war, he cannot afford to fail. Failure will mean, really spell the end of his time as leader of China. It may spell the end of the Chinese Communist Party's monopoly on power in China. And so if they decide to roll those dice, the escalation pressure, the pressure to escalate early is going to be very high in order to ensure victory. And that means looking at U.S. bases out in the Western Pacific in places like Okinawa and Guam, as you mentioned. It is possible. I don't think that Xi Jinping has shown himself to be a reckless gambler, but he has shown that his appetite for risk is going up.
The appeasers in the United States, and I use that as a term of art that was popular in the 30s. It was actually an ideology that was openly advocated for and embraced by Neville Chamberlain and Hoare and the other people out there. That strategy is feed the tiger and they will eventually be satisfied. Turns out, as Churchill said, the tiger eats you last. If they decide to go kinetic, does the United States have to respond kinetically, Matt? I mean, should there be any doubt in China's mind that our submarines will then sink everything they have to sink in response to a kinetic attack?
Well, look, if China attacks the United States, attacks our warships or our bases or our aircraft or our satellites in the course of launching a surprise attack on Taiwan, I can't imagine a scenario where the United States does not respond in kind. The real goal, the real challenge before us is to try to deter that outcome. To deny China the optimism. Look, Hugh, you're a student of history, and you know that it's often optimism that leads to war, right? Optimism is a leading cause of war. When aggressors believe that they can obtain more goals through war than they would otherwise be able to obtain, and they believe that they can attain them quickly and at acceptable cost, that is when wars begin. It begins with a surplus of optimism. Our goal has to be to begin draining the sense of optimism that I fear is accumulating in Beijing, and in particular in the mind of the one man who matters most in Beijing, and that is Xi Jinping, as he embarks on his second decade in power right now.
Yeah, I have not heard the term used before, roll the iron dice, and I love that term. I'm going to start stealing that. I will attribute it to Matt Pottinger. But there have been a lot of people sounding a lot of alarms for a long time. Our friend Jerry Hendricks, our friend Mark Montgomery, people who write, Admiral Stavridis, although he says 2034. There are lots of people who sound this alarm. What percentage of serious people, I mean, the people who study China, what percentage actually are on edge, Matt Pottinger? We have 1 minute, then we'll come back after the break. How many people are serious about the kinetic threat?
Well, look, I think that it's growing. I think that people are starting to look at some of the hard realities of what it's going to take to continue to deter China. Look, we've succeeded at deterring China from invading for 7 decades. We can extend the time horizon of that deterrence, but it means that we've got to get really serious on some of the steps that we need to take. And by the way, that phrase, rolling the iron dice, attribute it to the German Kaiser at the outset of World War II. It was the phrase that he used. People tend to think that World War I was an accident. It was not an accident. In fact, I don't believe in accidental wars. If you really look at what the leaders were thinking about, they made grave miscalculations about how a war would turn out. They made grave miscalculations about how long it would be, but they did get into this deliberately, and the Kaiser used this phrase.
We're going to come back and talk about the iron dice right after this. It will all be available on the podcast, and I'll play this part tomorrow morning in the first hour. Matt Pottinger, stand by. I'll be right back on the Hugh Hewitt Show. Matt Pottinger, it is very interesting to me that you brought up the Kaiser. Last night in Great Contemporaries, I was reading Winston Churchill's essay on the Kaiser in exile in Holland, and he talked about how he miscalculated so badly, and that sort of Germany forced him to miscalculate. The Prussian military, the German people, the example of Frederick the Great, all pushed the Kaiser into they don't have this phrase, Churchill didn't use the phrase, rolling the iron dice. So after the wars of the 20th century, Germany and Japan emerged beaten. Japan is now very strong and very aware and preparing. Germany is very weak, very irresolute, led by a knucklehead, as far as I can tell, Schultz is. Why is Japan so on their toes and Germany so clueless about the new Berlin, which is Beijing, and the new Rome, which is Tehran, and the new whatever it is that is Moscow, the new Entente, the new Axis, China, Russia, Iran? Why is Germany clueless?
Well, look, the sort of different responses that you see between Germany on the one hand and Japan on the other is, first, it's the first rule of real estate: location, location, location. The first three rules. Japan is right there in proximity. Japan is aware that if Taiwan were to be forcibly annexed by Beijing, that could be, in the words of some senior Japanese officials, an existential threat to Japan. It's harder to perceive that in Germany, far away. I think that strategic culture has really subsided in Germany in ways that are understandable for historical reasons, but which no longer serve Germany well today. It's sort of being reawakened in Japan. I think it was reawakened in part by the leadership of one of the great statesmen of this century, who was the former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, who, of course, was assassinated last year. His vision as a statesman for trying to deter a conflict, band together with the other democracies of the Indo-Pacific region. The fact we even talk about an Indo-Pacific is really in no small measure due to Prime Minister Abe himself and his view that India, as well as the United States and Australia and Japan, are need to serve as a quad of democracies to deter a conflict. His vision, even in death, is succeeding. Prime Minister Kishida has really moved forward with Prime Minister Abe's goal of doubling defense spending over the next few years in Japan in order to try to deter a conflict. Germany, it's just culturally and let's face it, a very small number of large German enterprises, not the majority, by the way. When you look at the family-owned businesses that are the real backbone of the German economy, they are increasingly woke to the threat from China. It's really just a couple of two or three major industrial players that I'm looking at you, Volkswagen, that really have thrown their lot in with China. Their future right now depends on China, but Germany, even Germany has, and Europe as a whole, has a significant trade deficit with China. They don't need China as much as they think. They need the U.S. economy far more. If you just look at the figures, the U.S. is the biggest market for Europe by far. I think China might be third place. So they just have to get used to a new reality. They've got to work harder to expand their markets in places other than China.
Matt Pottinger, I now want to turn to politics. The presidential campaign is underway. You're talking to Switzerland. I am a neutral. I don't have an opinion on who ought to be nominated. I may be asking a question at some point down the road at a presidential debate. If you were advising the presidential debate moderators on what to ask about China, of the 6 to 8 Republicans who are going to run against Joe Biden, Anthony Blinken, and your successor in interest, Jake Sullivan, what question would you pose to those Republican presidential candidates?
One question I would ask is, do you believe in your heart of hearts that the Chinese Communist Party can be trained to play by the same rules that we play by, that if we just pressure them a little bit, that we can induce good behavior from a Chinese Communist Party dictatorship, given all that we know about it right now? We still see vestiges of this thinking. We saw it in the Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen's speech the other day. There were good aspects of her speech, don't get me wrong, a slightly more realistic view, but still embedded in there is this idea that we can open up China's markets wider. We can induce them to play by our rules, and I think that that's just hopelessly naive. And so I would test that group of Republican nominees on the stage to see whether they're still clinging to that unrealistic idea. That would be one of them, Hugh.
Would they dodge a question on how they would respond to an attack on Taiwan? Do you think that's too obviously a provocative question that they would have to avoid with word salad?
I think that President Biden has done us all a favor by speaking publicly 4 times now, quite clearly. I've read the context of his quotes. He knows exactly what he was doing. He's trying to restore and extend deterrence in the Western Pacific by saying that if China attacks Taiwan, he will order the United States to respond militarily to defend Taiwan. I think that bit of clarity is something that no future president or future candidate for the presidency should retreat from.
So that's a good question to ask then. So let me wrap up by asking you, our culture was prepared for decades for this Cold War with the Soviet Union. In fiction, in movies, in Time magazine showing us the correlation of forces, the little guys who stood for brigades, the number of tanks, the number of airplanes, the number of warheads. That's not in the water anymore. People don't know anything about the CCP. You speak Mandarin. We now have hundreds of Mandarin-speaking people entering the border. Do you think that the American people are aware, just in the culture, of the threat that is out there in the way that they were at least aware in the culture, thanks to Le Carré, of the Soviet threat? Are we now aware of the Chinese Communist Party threat?
I think the American people have a good baseline instinct about the threat posed by the Chinese Communist Party. We're not as well attuned to the modalities of Beijing's aggression. Beijing is the master of camouflaging its intentions and its activities to make them look normal, when in fact they're often undertaking very sophisticated influence activities. They're better at this than the Soviets ever were. And I think you should, I don't know if you've had Alex Joske on your show yet, who just wrote a terrific book called Spies and Lies, where doing open source research, he was able to show how the Chinese spy agencies are not only involved in espionage and stealing secrets and trade secrets, they are heavily involved in trying to convince influential people, elites, policymakers, business leaders in our society and other societies that China's intentions are benign, that China in its heart wants to liberalize, and that there's a faction fighting to liberalize, and that they have very deliberately played up those types of expectations in order to induce us to provide even greater economic and market support for China in ways that you talked about the tiger eating us last. We've been feeding a baby tiger, and it's not as big as we are, but it's a formidable tiger now. It's bigger than the mountain lions that I sometimes see in this part of the country where I live out west of the Rockies.
I have 2 last questions, Matt. My first job in the executive branch way long ago in 1984 was as a special assistant to 2 attorneys general for the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court. So I reviewed the warrants. It was before we had a national security division. And I mean, it was an eye-opening. I've never seen anything like it. I was unaware of the Soviets, the East Germans, the Cubans, who were under deep cover in the United States that we knew about and we followed. And so I haven't had a clearance since 1989. I do not know the extent and breadth of the Chinese Communist Party secret apparatus. Do you know? I mean, obviously you do know. Do you think Americans ought to hire a Chinese national on a green card without some kind of vetting? Now, I know that Mike Pompeo, Robert O'Brien, your colleagues, both in the Trump administration on the Nixon seminar, they're always careful to say, do not confuse hostility to the Chinese Communist Party with hostilities to Chinese and to Chinese Americans, and I agree. But I do know that no one would have hired a Soviet on a green card without thinking twice in the 80s. Are we hiring Chinese nationals on green cards without thinking twice now?
You know, it's really interesting. There are certain things that we can be doing that are sort of low-hanging fruit ways to defend ourselves. Most of the Chinese students who come to the United States don't mean the United States harm. A lot of them want to stay in the United States. Chinese elites have never been more disaffected than they are right now with leadership of China under Xi Jinping. But there are things that we should do. For example, there's a Chinese scholarship program that a small percentage of Chinese students have arrived on, and that is a Chinese Communist Party plan that requires them to return to China and to carry back home with them everything that they learn and accumulate. I don't think we should be accepting students. And in fact, one of the things we did during the Trump administration was ban students into key technologies if they were on those Chinese government scholarships. But look, the counterintelligence threat is acute. The FBI director said just the other day that for every one official who's trying to protect our cyber domain, there are about 50 Chinese government-sponsored hackers in China. The FBI opens up a China-related case every 10 hours. If you look across the border in Canada, where there's a real serious drama that's unfolding right now, their counterintelligence officials and whistleblowers have gone public with the fact that China has been involved in a very sophisticated program to interfere in Canadian elections for the last several years, and may have successfully changed the outcome of several elections, both through illegal donations of money by the Chinese government and also using the WeChat social media platform and other media platforms to hobble candidates Beijing doesn't like and to amplify and support candidates it does like. This is why TikTok and WeChat are major problems in the United States, why we need to ban them. So look, it's formidable. We need our John le Carré we need brave producers and writers and distributors of popular content in Hollywood to carry content on these topics.
I was unaware of the Canadian story, Matt Pottinger. That's interesting to me. I should be aware of that. I'm not, and I wonder how do you stay smart now that you're out of the government? When you were in the National Security Deputy National Security Advisor, it all came to you. How do you stay smart using open sources now about what the CCP and Xi are up to?
Well, I've got a network of colleagues who are some of the best analysts of Chinese primary source documents in the world. Some of them are former intelligence officers. A lot of them are historians, former journalists, and the like. And we spend a lot of time. We write for Foreign Affairs magazine and other outlets about what we're seeing from Xi Jinping himself. There are other outlets that are out there that I think are useful summaries of Chinese and Western source media. Bill Bishop runs a newsletter most days called Sinosism, which I think is quite useful. And then just signal chats and different groups of people that I follow online keep me at least abreast of much of what's happening.
Matt Pottinger, thank you for your time this morning. I appreciate it. I hope you keep coming back. The Churchill Click needs Matt Pottinger in it, and I appreciate the time this morning. And I know you don't do Twitter, or where do people follow what you write, Matt?
Well, if you look at the Foundation for Defense of Democracy's webpage or the Hoover Institution bio page for me, they post most of my what I write and a lot of the media interviews that I do. Like you said, I'm not on social media, but the Hoover Institution bio page for me has a running catalog of what I'm writing and talking about.
That's where people should go. Matt Pottinger, keep coming back. Thank you for joining me early on a Monday morning on the first day of May 2023. I appreciate the time. Thank you, Matt.
Thank you.